Hey, how are you? Hey, good, good. All right, so who's going from, we're waiting for, we're waiting, we're waiting. Oh, I didn't even notice.
You guys took the start
Yes,
job.
it's a big mess.
All right,
Oh, okay.
the Rules Committee will come to order. Welcome back, everybody. I hope everybody had a good break, and it's great to see everybody. When most Americans think of the coast, they think of recreation, fishing, and tourism. But apparently, the president thinks of only one thing: oil rigs. President Trump has proposed a dangerous plan that would open more than 90% of the country's outer continental shelf to oil drilling. It's an unprecedented assault on our nation's oceans, all to pad the bottom line of his allies in the fossil fuel industry. Everyone else would pay the price. An estimated 2.6 million jobs would be threatened. Nearly $180 billion in GDP would be put at risk, and countless coastal ecosystems would be harmed. It's no surprise that every East and West Coast governor, Republican and Democrat, has expressed opposition to offshore drilling. They're joined by business leaders, commercial fishermen, and environmentalists, along with the majority of the American people. One man in the Oval Office should not be allowed to put polluter profits above the public interest. So we are considering H.R. 1941 today to put a permanent moratorium on oil and gas leasing on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and H.R. 205, which would place a permanent moratorium on oil and gas leasing in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. We are also taking action on H.R. 1146 to protect Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, one of the largest tracts of untouched land left in our country. The president and some Republican leaders have tucked a provision in their tax scam plan to open its coastal plain to drilling, and the first leases could be issued this year. That's despite some of the president's own Interior Department saying the administration failed to adequately consider oil spills, climate change, and the impact on wildlife in its environmental review. My friends on the other side have used rosy economic assumptions to try to justify turning this pristine land into the site of oil wells and gravel roads. But the New York Times recently found these leases could bring in as little as $45 million over the next 10 years. And that could be on the high end. Let's remember that one well drilled close to Anwar on a site thought to be rich with oil turned out to be dry. A provision airdropped into an unrelated bill, no proper environmental review, and no idea what will happen once drilling starts. It's a recipe for irreversible disaster. The 5 biggest oil companies already earn more in 60 seconds than 95% of the American households make in a year. They don't need any more giveaways, and certainly not at the expense of people's livelihoods and our environment. So with that, I would happy now to turn this over to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make, and I welcome him back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin, I just want to say that I hope you had as good an August and early September as I did. It's always a pleasure to be back in the district, speak with constituents, and hear what's on their minds at town hall meetings. But the best news of all for me is I got to go to the first 2 OU football games, and we're 2-0. And we are where we want to be. I want to congratulate my friend on upsetting Nebraska. There are important things happening. It was a great game. There are important things happening in America, even when Congress is not in session.
Absolutely.
So let's start where we can agree. And I'm genuinely pleased to be back here with you and the other members of our committee. And I look forward to tackling important legislation in the weeks ahead. I think we've got a lot to do between now and the end of December. Some of it we're not going to agree on, but I think there's a lot of things, honestly, we will agree on. And I look forward to working with my friends on both sides of the aisle. This afternoon's hearing is on 3 separate bills that we probably won't see eye to eye on, that really should be considered as one package. Taken together, the 3 bills will permanently ban oil and gas drilling off the coast of Florida and the Gulf of Mexico, will permanently ban development of oil and gas resources in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and will extend a temporary ban on oil and gas drilling and exploration off the Atlantic and Pacific coast. My home state of Oklahoma has long been a center for producing domestic oil and gas, and since the development of new extraction technologies, the state's taken a big leap forward. New developments in this area mean more jobs and more revenue for states. In putting forward these bills, I'm worried that we're depriving other states of the opportunity to make that same choice. And in the case of Alaska, I'm worried that we're depriving native corporations of making that choice for their own people, even on land they currently own. Moreover, the entire Alaska delegation, both the Senate and the House, obviously has a different view of this legislation. It's very different than Florida in that respect. If these bills were to become law, we would only be making it harder to develop our domestic energy resources that will cost us jobs and tax revenues and will increase our dependence on foreign energy imports. And I think it's worth really emphasizing that last point for a couple of reasons. Most of America is enjoying, frankly, much cheaper gasoline rates, much cheaper heating rates, much cheaper cooling rates than they did. That's real money in real people's pocket, not to mention the jobs associated. And it's also strategic independence for the United States. We're a lot less dependent on Middle East oil. We're essentially, North America is now energy independent. And that's been an important tool for us, and I think that shouldn't be lost in the debate that we have. We'll also be depriving certain federal programs of much-needed resources. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, for example, is funded in part by revenues from oil and gas leases on the Outer Continental Shelf. Banning new oil and gas leases in the OCS regions means that we'll have less funds available for this important program. Mr. Chairman, I understand the concerns motivating these bills, but I'm concerned that by simply passing blanket bans on new oil and gas development in these regions, we're simply throwing the baby out with the bathwater. A better approach would be to develop a comprehensive national, all-of-the-above energy policy and let the affected states make the determination for themselves as to whether to develop these resources, as my home state has done. That, to me, is a better direction for these regions, for Native tribes, and for the American people. I look forward to our hearing, and I thank you for your recognition. Yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. I want to thank you for his opening statement. I now would like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on H.R. 1941, H.R. 205, and H.R. 1146. So, Subcommittee Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Bishop, we're delighted that you're here. Anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And Mr. Lowenthal, you can begin. Just make sure you turn your microphone on, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to you, Chairman McGovern, and to you, Ranking Member Cole. I'm here to testify in support of a rule for 3 bills that will protect one of America's last great wilderness areas and communities, and also the communities along the Atlantic and the Pacific coast and the eastern Gulf of Mexico, from the Trump administration's energy dominance agenda. H.R. 1146, the Arctic Culture and Coastal Plain Protection Act, was introduced by the chairman of the Water, Oceans, and Wildlife Subcommittee, Mr. Huffman of California, and is co-sponsored by 182 members from both sides of the aisle. H.R. 205, the Protecting and Securing Florida's Coastline Act, would permanently protect the eastern Gulf of Mexico from oil and gas drilling. This bill was introduced by our colleague who's also here today, Mr. Rooney, and that too is supported by members from both sides of the aisle. H.R. 1941, the Coastal and Marine Economies Protection Act, would permanently protect the Atlantic and the Pacific coast. This bill was introduced by our colleague from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham, and it's also supported by members from both sides of the aisle. Offshore oil and gas development primarily takes place in the western and the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, and to a much smaller degree off the southern coast of California. These 2 bills that we're talking about the offshore drilling, H.R. 205 and H.R. 1941, would not impact current offshore oil and gas operations, nor would these bills impact leasing in the central or the western Gulf of Mexico. Instead, these bills will protect Americans and businesses that rely on healthy oceans and cheap beaches for their economic survival and coastal way of life. Shoreline counties are home to over 125 million citizens, nearly 40% of the United States' population. And the clean ocean economy employs more people than telecommunications, crop productions, and the building construction industries all combined. For example, in my home state of California, close to 500,000 people are employed in the fishing, seafood, aquaculture, coastal tourism, and recreational industries, and these jobs generate over $12 billion in annual wages. The offshore rigs and the platforms and the onshore infrastructure necessary for drilling will create extensive risks for millions of citizens and thousands of businesses. As I said, my state and other coastal states, which are represented by members of this committee, understand that our existing economies are incompatible with offshore oil and gas development. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has decided to risk the livelihoods of millions to further pad the pockets of a handful of oil and gas industry executives. The Interior Department proposed opening more than 90% of the outer continental shelf to oil and gas development, including the entirety of America's Atlantic, America's Pacific, and all of the Gulf Coast. In total, President Trump wants to offer up over 1.6 billion acres of America's oceans to the oil and gas industries. In April, Interior Secretary Bernhardt indicated that the development of the leasing program has now been placed at least on hold due to a recent court decision. But that's only a short-term reprieve. At any moment, the administration can restart their efforts to auction off our nation's coast. Our coastal communities and businesses do not want to have to deal with the threat of offshore drilling constantly hanging over their heads. And they don't want to fight the same fights every couple of years. Coastal communities will not be truly protected from the risks of offshore drilling until we enact H.R. 205 and H.R. 1941. As I mentioned earlier, the third bill, H.R. 1146, would end the efforts to lease one of America's last great wilderness areas, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, for oil and gas drilling. Efforts that are currently being conducted hastily and haphazardly and over the numerous objections of career scientists. Let's be clear. We are discussing this issue today with far more care and in far more detail than the Republicans did in the previous Congress when they attached the provision opening up the refuge to their 2017 tax bill. There was no separate bill to open the Arctic refuge. There was no rule. There was no amendments. There was no debate. There were no votes. It was a completely unrelated provision that was included under the specious argument that it helped offset roughly 0.06 of 1%, that's 0.06% of the cost of that tax bill. There was no need, there still is no need to turn this fragile wilderness into the newest Arctic oil and gas field. We held a hearing on this legislation in the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee on March 26th, and 5 Native Alaskans testified about the critical importance of the coastal plain of the Arctic to their culture and way of life. They called the refuge the sacred place where life begins. And that sacred place is in imminent danger. That's why this legislation is so necessary. This bill doesn't put the Arctic refuge permanently off limits. It simply undoes the unrelated provisions of opening it up that was just stuck into the tax bill. This bill is our chance to undo the mistake from 2 years ago, to protect a fragile wilderness and protect the tribe's way of life. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. Welcome.
Thank you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity of being back here in Washington and participating in this meeting. I'm sure it's vital to all of us. So having done that, let me do the first things I have to do and check the box. So let me thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member and the rest of the committee members for fulfilling your duty and being back here. Check one. Check two, as a minority, I'm supposed to ask for an open rule. Yeah. Which is when I was here in the minority always asked for an open rule. I'm going to save you that. I don't ever think there should be an open rule. In anything, I'm sorry. That's the purpose of having committees in the first place. That's the reason for having committees in the first place. But what you do need when it goes to the floor is to make sure that there is enough dialogue and debate taking place on the floor. So I would like you to have a structured rule that has significant amount of debate in it. These bills came through my committee. My committee has changed the process now so that we roll votes, which means everyone was there to vote on it. Nobody was there to listen to any of the debate. So yeah, these amendments may have been debated, but no one heard it, and they were voted on everyone who wasn't there. If you can eliminate rolled votes, both in committee and on the floor, we would have a much better Congress. So I do want a structured rule that has significant amount of debate that will go through on these three bills, and they are not necessarily the same bills. If we try to interlink them, they may have a common topic, but they are woefully different than the others. There is an element of hypocrisy in these bills at the same time. Each one has an alleged cost. How you got a $200 million, billion or million for your bill? How you got a cost on the Rooney bill is amazing to me. But each bill has a different, one has 900, one has 400, one has 200 million. And the majority party in this case has used the same offset for each bill. So the same numbers, the same source, they just tripled it every time. So having an offset doesn't really happen on these three bills. Not only that is to get the numbers to match, you had to adjust what the numbers are. So technically the offset is on inspection fees that would have been going on in each of these projects. So for the $900 billion, is it billion or million? Billion? Billion. The $900 billion bill, we increased what the fees would cost and generate. For the $200 billion one, we decreased what the fees would cost and generate, but they are the same inspection fees for all three bills. So it's all coming from the same pot. And if you're actually going to physically count that as an offset for all three of the bills, you're triple, this is funny math and funny accounting, regardless of how you want to describe it. You were correct also in saying that we have a lot of verbiage about how important the LWCF is. The LWCF, which everyone in this room likes and voted for and keeps talking about how we should spend more money, it comes from these sources. You cut these sources, you cut the money that's available for the LWCF. So have it one way or the other, but don't do it both ways. I forgot to mention this. Thank you for saying Oklahoma's 2-0. So's Utah. And Colorado, you're coming to Salt Lake City this year, so I'll be waiting for you. That is obviously the important stuff that comes there. There's another element that is unique about this. Like when I was in college, gas was a quarter a gallon. And when I pulled up to a gas station, there was a kid my age or younger that would come out, not only pump the gas, but wash the windshields, check the oil, check the tires, and then they would give me a plate or a towel for having shown up. I then left and came back from 2 years in Germany, and the oil embargo had taken place first. And no longer did any of that happen. You had to do your own work. And gas was going to the incredible total of almost $1.80 a gallon. We were really worried when it hit $2 a gallon. And we found out that there was forces that were opposed to our country that were using our energy lack of energy independence, our energy dependence, with 70% coming from OPEC to try and force a change in our foreign policy. And the president at the time put on a sweater and started a fire and told us to be grateful that you would be cold and in the dark. You're going to just have to learn to do with less. Fortunately, this country didn't do that. Neither the industry nor the government went along with that, and we have changed that course till now we are in a position of being energy independent. We are actually an exporter of things like LNG at this stage of the game. We're no longer being able to threaten. And indeed, if we develop the resources that we have, we will be a source of not only independence for ourselves, but a source of support for our allies, and our allies will not have to work or deal with Russian gas or Russian oil, which is far dirtier when it pollutes than anything that comes from the United States. What these three bills do is take us back towards that era when we once again become dependent because we tie our own hands, or will be tying our hands in this particular future. It will cost us jobs. It will cost the economy. Everyone that speaks out for these bills does not want to quit heating their homes in the winter or air conditioning them in the summer or driving their cars or having their boats or taking flights. They just want somebody else to do it, so it's not necessarily in their backyard. This is also an element which, once again, hypocrisy comes in here, and I'm sorry. Lots of people have told me in our committee, we want science to be the basis of our decisions. What does the science say? I'm sorry, the science in each three of these bills says you can have economic development and conservation and recreation at the same time. It's a large area. We are a large country. It can be. That's what the science says. These bills are not based on science. They're based on politics. Yeah, it can be done scientifically. We just don't politically want it to be the case. So that you have governors of certain states who want to make decisions on federal waters that are off their states, which I could almost allow if you would allow the governors of inland states to be able to have control over federal land within our state. Then maybe I would at least be a little bit sympathetic to one of the costs that is here. I also want to know that these things are significantly different. When Mr. Lowenthal was talking about the Arctic refuge, that's not what we're talking about in this bill. The 1002 section is not the refuge. It's a small section set aside for oil and gas production. And that's what was part of the tax bill. That's been part of the discussion all along. It's not the entire refuge that's going there. It's simply something whose very existence was supposed to be for this very purpose in what we're doing. And we have decided that. Now we're trying to backtrack and go back and do it one more time. Mr. Rooney's bill is very much different from Mr. Cunningham's bill. Mr. Rooney's bill deals with the issue of military uses in that particular area, a zone that was set aside specifically for the military. And I understand that, which is why I desperately hope that some amendments that I have will be made in order so we can actually talk about it, because that is different than the other bill. There is a reason for having military exclusions for some of those areas. But when we take an arbitrary line, as they did in the Bush administration, and just run that line down the Gulf, what you found out is the western side of that line is actually closer to Mississippi, Alabama, and New Orleans than it is to Florida. And it has a greater impact on New Orleans than it does to Florida. Let us use this process of actually having science come in here and say, are there areas which should be set aside for military preservation, and then damn right, make sure that happens. But are there areas that don't have to be in this silly arbitrary line? Let's deal with those type of situations on the case-by-case basis and let the military have the primary decision on what it does need and what it does not need, which is what we're trying to talk about. So his bill is not like the other two bills. There is a difference in all three of these. All three of these are politically motivated, not scientifically motivated. All three of these have lousy offsets. In fact, it's the same offset that doesn't really make sense whatsoever. And you've got Energy Week, so you got to do something. I guess this is as good as it gets.
Well, Mr. Bishop, let me check the box and thank you for your testimony. And I have no questions. Let me turn it over to Mr. Hastings.
I have no question.
Oh, come on.
Mr. Cole.
Ask me how I'm doing. This is a long time here.
I can tell you're going to miss Congress a lot, Mr. Bishop. I do have a couple questions for you. And number one, I just want to tell you how much I'm going to miss you. I know you've announced you're not going to run for re-election. You would win, and you're a very valuable voice in this body and have been throughout your entire time here. So I wish you well in your retirement.
Did you just hear that? Were you listening to
That he
that?
wished you well?
No.
They only hear the parts they want to. That's pretty typical of most speeches I give. But let me ask you this. I know Mr. Lowenthal mentioned that the number of Alaska Native corporations did come and testify, and I appreciate that very much. Does the legislation require consultation with all Alaska Native corporations in or near ANWR in terms of what their opinion is?
No.
I didn't think so. And I would submit that we probably need to talk to everybody because there are always differences between different tribal governments and as to what they think is appropriate with what is effectively their land or impacts their land. Second question, and you addressed this, but I want to make it crystal clear. By taking domestic energy resources off the table, it seems these bills would increase our reliance on foreign oil imports, result in the loss of many well-paying jobs. Would you agree that this would make us rely more on foreign bad actors that hinder domestic job creation?
It doesn't have to, but it certainly gives the propensity of doing that.
And do we-
especially in Europe, with the Russians being the alternative, yes, that would.
I think there's also some interesting information, I don't know if your committee dealt with it or not, about the difference in the environmental footprint of what American corporations do with what corporations elsewhere do that we would then end up purchasing from. I mean, environmentally, if you take what is effectively much cleaner production off and replace it with production that is less well-regulated, the environmental footprint is actually globally worse than, as opposed to being better. Is that a fair point to make, and did your committee look at that at all?
The committee did not look at it, but the numbers are roughly about a 13% greater amount of pollutants would be coming into the environment.
So if the idea is to lessen pollution, we wouldn't be taking this off. We'd be trying to get other countries to rise up to the standards that we have here, I presume.
Yeah.
Okay. And like the other bills, coming through here, you made a reference to this. I personally have a hard time seeing this getting much traction in the United States Senate. What's your view of what the prospect for any of this legislation is in terms of the Senate?
It's slim or none, and I think the SAP says that he would veto any of these three bills. But I seriously doubt any of these three would be taken up or taken seriously in the Senate.
Okay, and to your point, if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask, without objection, to enter the statement of administration policy into the record, which, as Mr. Bishop suggests, indicates that the president would not support these things. So
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So there's not much chance of this ever becoming law.
No, and could I just say, the lack of the Senate's willingness to follow our actions and do what we're doing is not necessarily a reason not to do it. But in this case, I think there are some logical reasons why you don't want to go down this path, which you've already identified. You did talk about the disbursement of the royalties that comes from these sources, and I think in 2018 it was like about $9 billion. Of those, $1 billion went to Native American tribes, which would be put in jeopardy. 1.7 billion were distributed to 36 states. That also could be put in jeopardy. So it's not only a bad bill, it's got unintended consequences that could be negative for a whole lot of states.
Well, I just want to associate myself with your remarks that this is much more political exercise, in my view, than it is a serious legislative attempt, because there's lots of damages that will come, and fortunately, they're not likely to occur right now. But I have been here when we had $4 a gallon gasoline. I have been here when natural gas was $14 a 1,000 cubic feet. And I can tell you that hits the pocketbook of every single American. These kind of policies would put us right back in that situation. This is legislation that will literally lower the living standards of millions of Americans, both people directly involved in the industry, but not just them, people that just need to drive to get to work, people that just need reasonably priced electricity to heat and cool their homes. All that is made worse by this legislation. And finally, I just want to add the point, and then I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. I have respect for my friends in Florida. I actually have the viewpoint my friend Mr. Bishop does. This is a federal asset, not a state asset. But if we're going to do that, we probably ought to give Mr. Bishop what he wants in terms of jurisdiction over what percentage of the state of Utah is owned by the federal government.
It's only 60% that you're the slumlords for us.
Okay, so we're doing this for certain select states. We're not doing it for everybody. But that aside, in the case of Alaska, any question, the people in Alaska and the congressional delegation in Alaska are opposed to the legislation that's being offered that impacts their state, every single member. Both senators, only one House member, but a pretty formidable House member. So, I would suggest, if we're going to do for the coastal states what seems to be popular, that's fine. Why don't we do that for Alaska? Is there any reason why we would decide that what governors and legislative delegations think about a federal asset is important along the coast, but evidently not important in Alaska?
And no, what you're talking about is just the way we deal with the federal ownership of everything. And we seem to deal with it when it's convenient for one sense, and then we'll ignore it when it's inconvenient again. So, yeah, if you want to have an active policy that deals with all federal waters and federal lands, do so. Once again, this ain't it.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Perlmutter?
Mr. Chairman, gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. Mr. Bishop, thank you for all of your service. You're going to be here for at least another year or so, but I just wanted to say both of you guys are friends of mine. I do have a question, though, and the gentleman from Utah kept talking about the fuzzy math and the hypocrisy of the math, and I'd say to my friend from California, if I recall correctly, the fuzzy math came by adding these things into the tax bill to try to prop up the tax bill so that it could be run through so that we didn't have to get a supermajority over in the Senate side. So the real issue here are all the add-ons at the very end of the tax bill that drove and is driving a $2 trillion deficit. So I'd open it to Mr. Lowenthal and then to you, Mr. Bishop.
Well, I agree, and I think, it was very interesting listening to the ranking member talking and others about tribal consultation. There was no tribal consultation when the ANWR provision was added to the tax bill. None, zero. It was put in without any consultation, any public kinds of consultation. And so what more?
That's Mr. Bishop.
Well, yeah, we're not quite talking the same thing. My fuzzy math deals with the offsets that are being used for all three bills. All the offsets, they had the numbers skewed. They use the same offset for each bill. I'm sorry, if you use it for the first bill, you've wasted it. You can't use it for the second bill and then for the third bill, but that's exactly what we've done. That's where the fuzzy math comes in here. The offsets are quirky. That's the nicest way. Stupid is a better way.
Can I respond to what I think the biggest fuzzy math is this argument that implementing these bills will make the U.S. more energy dependent on foreign nations. We're going to put our energy at risk. I think it's important to look at the real data that's out there. First of all, none of these bills take away from the production of oil and gas that already exists in the United States. None. And how much does exist in the United States? Last year, the United States produced 12.3 million barrels of crude oil every single day, which was a U.S. record and the most oil produced in the world. That's the first thing. We exported over 3 million barrels of crude oil each and every day in 2018, which was more than almost any other country, and only one or two nations in OPEC actually exceeded that. So the fact is that by using our existing resources, and let's just talk about that, on offshore, most of the existing resources are in the central and western part of the Gulf of Mexico. Nobody is talking about excluding those. Nobody, and actually, the U.S. Geological Service has estimated, and others, that we have in the western and central part of the Gulf, which we're not talking about, that there is an estimated 43 billion barrels of oil in the Gulf yet to be produced, and yet to be even discovered. That's enough at 2018 year levels for 66 additional years. That's the math.
All right. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Mr. Woodall? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am glad to be back with you all because I've been reading about you for the last 45 days, and you sound like a bunch of scoundrels on both sides of the aisle. I'm glad to get back to seeing some personalities that put those things into context. I think the first time I heard about Anwar was my first day on Capitol Hill as a staffer in 1994. I don't know what kind of consultation took place before the tax bill was passed, but I know folks have been arguing about it for a long, long time, and I seem to remember, and I'm willing to be corrected because I've been out of the speaking game here, the accountability game for a little while, but I think President Clinton said something very similar to you, Mr. Lowenthal, in 1996, that what difference does it make if we open up this section and begin drilling in this section of Anwar, because it'll take 10 years to get anything online, and by 10 years from now, we'll have all these problems sorted out anyway. Remembering gas prices in 2006, we did not have everything sorted out by that time. But I wanted to ask Mr. Bishop in particular about an amendment he had, because I get the talking points about President Trump and special interest and congressional Republicans and all of that in the last 3 years. But your amendment deals with a part of the bill that affects a law that's been in place for more than a decade, and dealing with the military mission line, with a prohibition that is already in place through 2022, and your amendment would preserve that current law from 2006. Could you talk a little bit about that?
There are actually 3 different amendments in there. One is there already is in an agreement, an MOU, between the Interior Department and the Department of Defense on how they would go into consultation and work. One of the amendments would simply codify that once the permanent ban is removed. So there would have to be consultation between the two. They would have to reach an agreement. I think the other 2 simply say, yes, it would be required that the mission line could be extended, but the Department of Defense would have the prerogative to simply say, we don't need these areas, and therefore we could work with the Interior Department scientifically to develop those areas that would not be in the need for a military mission. And that would, once again, I think it gives us the right approach that if it's important for the military, then sure, yeah, let's deal with it. Let them decide which part of that they need, and if there's areas that aren't necessarily needed, and they have indicated informally that there aren't all those areas that are needed for the military mission, then let the science and the Department of Interior develop those areas.
And to Mr. Lowenthal's point, that development is not going on today because current law already bans that through 2022. Your amendment would simply say that after 2022, as current law already requires, as the MOU already requires, if the Interior Department and the military were on the same page, then the Interior Department could authorize that drilling.
Well, if the ban is lifted in 2022, it's a different issue. But with his bill, which would continue that bill forever, what I'm simply saying is within that area, instead of just drawing a straight line, allow the military to decide what areas are important to them and what areas are not important to them. Those areas that they don't need for military purposes, then allow development in those particular areas. But that would be done on a scientific basis.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. You go back, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Cannon? Mr. Burgess?
Thank you, and it is good to see Chairman Bishop back here in the Rules Committee. We're grateful for your service that you have offered us and your words of wisdom that you've always unfailingly provided us. Like Rob, I remember the discussion of Anwar, like Mr. Woodall of Georgia, I remember the discussion of Anwar back in the 1990s. Now, I had nothing to do with the United States House of Representatives in the 1990s, but I do remember the discussion. And I remember President Clinton vetoing the 1996 budget, which actually had the development of the 1002 part of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. Now, when I arrived in the United States Congress, the same time as Mr. Bishop in 2003, I was on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. The chairman at that time was Don Young, and he felt pretty strongly about the development of the 1002 portion of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. And I remember one summer he took a bunch of us up to Kaktovik, and we spent a good deal of time up in Kaktovik, Alaska, and talked to the native populations there. The mayor of the town was an Alaskan native, their perception was they needed, this was their resource, and they ought to be able to develop it. They ought to be able to benefit from the financial wherewithal that was below the ground, and they didn't understand why the United States Congress was even involved in the discussion. I will tell you, I thought that day back in 2003, we would come back here, get that sorted out, and get that fixed up for them. But here we are now, some 18 years later, continuing to talk about it, and it is, it's always been a mystery to me why that hasn't happened. I also was here in 2007 and 2008 when the price for all fuel sources became extremely high, and I remember the arguments of the Energy and Commerce Committee that it would do no good to increase production because it would take 7 years before any increased production would actually impact the market. And that was just simply too long a time horizon. So there was nothing to be done about these high prices by increasing production. It would have to be done under price controls or some other government action. But increasing production was not the trajectory to follow to solve a problem for the American people. Well, in retrospect, now we've gone 7 years and then some. And all of, again, these problems, it seems, could have been solved. Problems that don't exist below the ground, they exist above the ground, and they exist with the governing structure that we have. I was grateful when the bill passed that allowed the exploration of Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, the 1002 portion. Remembering the discussion that the mayor had with us that day, I thought, I don't know if he's still mayor of Kaktovik, perhaps not, but nevertheless, they've been long-suffering folks, and they have been anxious to get to what they think is something that would be a benefit to them. So I guess, Mr. Bishop, what I would say is, in line with what your earlier comment, I hope we will make Mr. Young's amendment in order and have that debated in a fulsome fashion, at least on the floor of the House of Representatives, so we can have the opportunity to have that discussion yet one more time here in the House.
Mr. Young obviously can speak to this more fluently than I, but you're right. Most of the leadership of those Native populations have been longtime supporters of what we're trying to do. And what we always used to talk about, going back from when we first came here, if this table was the entire refuge and you put a postage stamp on it, that's the size of 1002. That's the portion we're talking about. It's not the refuge. It's not the entire ecosystem that's up there. It's that small section that was set aside specifically for this purpose. We should not go back on that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Morelli? Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for coming here to testify. An important issue. I honestly, and I'm trying to have an open mind, but I honestly don't understand the reasoning why we would want to go back, as Mr. Bishop said, back to the 1970s, where we're reliant on OPEC for our energy resources. I mean, when it could have an abundance, and we are with the current shale oil and gas that's going on, but why would we want to limit ourselves and be possibly reliant on foreign countries that are often hostile to us? I don't quite understand it. So I want to briefly, I'm going to ask a question, but I want to briefly just read. There was a recent article that I read from June 20th of this year, and it was co-authored by Jim Webb, a former Democrat senator from Virginia. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there was a couple good things I thought. He said 94% of the outer continental shelf of the United States is currently off limits to offshore exploration and development. Currently, the United States is one of the only countries along the Atlantic that is not actively exploring for energy in those waters. Nations both near and far, many with fewer resources and far less stringent environmental regulations, are adopting policies that allow them to proceed with offshore development. But the United States remains at a standstill. This has very serious implications. As the Washington Post opined earlier this year, as long as the economy requires oil, it must come from somewhere. And better the United States than a country with much weaker environmental oversight. In fact, because of current U.S. policy, major energy investments are moving to countries like Mexico, where regulations could lag even farther behind ours. Over the last 4 years, as we have debated whether to open up carefully selected new areas for exploration on our side of the Gulf of Mexico, Mexico has leased over 20 million new acres on its side. The country's total acreage leased in the Gulf is now over 30 million acres, double that of the U.S.'s 14.7 million. And he goes on to advocate for more opening up our coastal lines for research and development in oil and gas. Mr. Bishop, I thought it was interesting when I was reading up on these bills that you had brought up about hypocrisy that goes on, and I know it goes on, but the one that really stood out to me was that California in 2016 bought $4.7 billion worth of oil from Saudi Arabia, which the profits benefit the royal family. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Bishop? That one really stood out to me.
Well, there are, I have that, but I won't say anything about your state. I'll be nicer than that. Look, I am sorry that you weren't with us in Germany, because there are unintended consequences of everything you're doing, and that's what you're talking about. So when we were over there talking to them, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would bring Russian oil and gas into Germany, is a major problem for us. It's a major concern from every one of our NATO allies that are around Germany, and it was a topic of discussion all the time. And that ties in exactly to what we are attempting to do here, which would be putting us in a negative situation compared to them. When Alan and I were at Lithuania, they are using LNG gas coming from us on a private port, and they are extremely significant and important to them. So how we relate with our international affairs, specifically vis-a-vis the Russians, who still use oil and gas as a national weapon, is significant. And it should not be eliminated from this debate. This debate should not simply be in isolation from all those other factors. So yeah, that is a concern. And what we do to try and become a larger exporter so that we can be a better benefit to our allies and be in the position of being able to provide an alternative so they don't have to rely on Russian oil and gas and eventually Russian blackmail that comes with it. That's a situation. So whether it's here, whether it's in Russian oil and gas coming into Boston because we don't have enough transportation lines, moving it in there for their needs, whether it's what happens in California, all those should be part of the conversation, which is why if you would allow amendments that deal with that topic to be in order in the debate, it would be a much more riveting debate on the floor on these issues than not.
Thank you very much. And speaking of amendments, Mr. Chairman, can I just kind of explain my amendment while I'm talking? All right.
Please proceed.
I do have an amendment, and it's pretty simple. It just says, "The Secretary of the Interior, after consulting with the Secretary of Defense, shall report to Congress on whether this act poses a risk to national security due to potential increase in dependence on foreign oil." And that's exactly what we've been talking about. That really is a concern of mine. Not only potential jobs that we're going to lose and that type of thing, but I do really believe it's a national security risk, because if we don't utilize our resources in America that we have, which we are blessed to have, and we're still going to consume it, why would we want to rely on foreign countries? Why would we want to rely on OPEC? Why would we allow them to have leverage over us? And Russia just recently did an accord with OPEC and to try to manipulate the prices. So why would we do that? I just don't understand. So I asked my colleagues if you would please rule this particular amendment and other good ones in order. Thank you.
Ms. Shalala?
You know, in Florida, Mr. Bishop, we think that this opening up drilling on the Eastern Gulf is so really threatens the Florida economy because we're so dependent on tourism. And we still remember Deepwater Horizon, the catastrophe, which cost the economy $22 billion in tourism dollars. In addition to that, the military, the Department of Defense, has already said that without restrictions on oil and gas activities in the Eastern Gulf, military flexibility in the region would be lost and test and training activities would be severely affected. And that's why there's bipartisan support. Mr. Rooney has sponsored H.R. 205. The Florida delegation, and we've heard from Floridians that they're opposed to drilling off our coast. Why should Congress ignore the will of lawmakers in Florida, including Mr. Rooney, who's a sponsor of this bill, knowing what we know and our own experience with the disaster of Deepwater Horizon?
Well, you have passed, was it a referendum on state waters off the coast of Florida?
Yes.
Okay. You've done that on state waters, which is legitimate and appropriate. What we're talking about are now federal waters that don't belong to the state of Florida beyond that.
I get that.
Wait a minute. Federal waters that on the coast, on the far west end of that, are closer to New Orleans than they are to Florida. So what we're talking about is the statements that have been made by the military and others are not as absolute as what you just said. If indeed there is a military reason for keeping the line, for hell's sakes, keep the line. If there is a military reason for exclusion, and let's face it, there are some reasons why you would in Florida, because Eglin Air Force Base is unique, the other bases are unique, you have a water test and training range, not as good as the land ones we have in Utah, but you have a water one that's out there, those are unique. If indeed those are unique, keep them off. But if there are areas that are not necessary for the military mission, then allow the Department of Defense to make that statement, then allow those to be set up for scientific purposes. So, once again, you can have your cake and eat it too in this particular situation. You can have his bill and still protect the military stuff and still have some limited production in those areas that are far, far away from Florida on federal waters.
You can't assure me that we're not taking some risk if there's another spill.
You can't assure you're not going to be killed going out to the floor today, but the probability is extremely low, and that's where science comes in. Not politics, but science. For once, trust the science on this issue.
I yield back.
Mr. DeSaulnier. All right, thank you all so very much. Appreciate it very much. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. Please leave anything you would like inserted into the record with our stenographer, and you now just...
Can I have the
Yes,
nice
Rob?
comments people made about me written down so I can use it for my funeral?
What do you need, Rob?
I said, can I have the nice statements you guys said about me written down so I can use it for my funeral?
Rob, don't trust your luck on keeping things like I mean, you know, you and I know each other well. Okay. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Ms. Castor and Mr. Rooney, I welcome you as our next panel. Call them. We're delighted that you both are here, and anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now recognize Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Cole. I just might comment on a few of the points that were raised here. The first one is a comment was made about the Nord Stream pipeline, and I think there's a mixing of apples and oranges here. Our strategic weapon in Europe is liquefied natural gas, of which we have a abundancy that will long outlive our great-grandchildren, and they keep finding more of it every day. And the problem with the Nord Stream pipeline is Germany, and that former Chancellor Schroeder is on the board of a Russian company that's developing it. And the fact that we have let Germany roll us over on that is a travesty. And I will say, bipartisan-wise, the Foreign Affairs Committee has weighed in big time on that, but we haven't seen fit to get the administration to put enough heat on Germany to stop it. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is, allusion was made about the military mission line and training. And as Chairman Bishop said, yes, it's critical that we train out there on that military mission line. The hottest part of that line, where all the most intense testing is, where they shoot off Polaris missiles, where they do the flying 100 feet above the water testing RF and things like that, is right out there on just the eastern side of that line, exactly where the oil companies want to drill. The part where they don't, where it's not as necessary, is the part that's in close, where we have the highest risk of spills migrating to our coast. You've got a clockwise current called the loop current that starts in Alabama and runs right down the coast. And that's all the more reason that we've got to have this line way far away so there can be no perception of anything getting into that loop current and coming down and trashing out the west coast of Florida, where Kathy and I represent. The other thing is the energy independence was brought up. We are more than energy independent right now, and I'm in the oil business. Okay, they say that there's 20 billion barrels in the Permian in the Wolfcamp sand alone, excluding the Sprayberry and the Cline Shale. There's probably 50 or 60 billion barrels total there, in addition to the 40 billion in the Western Gulf. The reason all that drilling's in the Western Gulf is that's where the big reserves are. And that's my whole argument here is why put Florida at risk for, as Congresswoman Shalala said, for a nominal amount of production. The risk of Florida is not justified by the return. And in business, that's what we do. And the CEO of Shell has even backed that up. He has put out an article basically saying that we are going to have peak demand for oil in the 2030s because of the rise of electric cars and things like that. Well, guess how they need to be powered? Those power plants need to be run by natural gas. Not coal, natural gas. Florida is almost all natural gas now. We pretty well run coal out of the state, and that's why we're clean and people want to come live there. The other thing is you can look at the export-import charts, which I've given to this committee before, showing that we are actually exporting from the United States, which Congress, before I got here, allowed to happen. And now as we bring on more and more fields, it's going to continue to increase. So we are not dependent on Saudi Arabia. Okay, that's part of their whole problem right now. The other thing, a comment was made about the countries and companies with greater environmental risk. I'd point out that the same companies that are drilling in Equatorial Guinea, drilling off of Israel, drilling sometimes even in Russia, certainly, and drilling in the United States and in the Gulf of Mexico are the same companies. Chevron, Exxon, Shell, State Oil, Anadarko. Those are the ones that are doing all the work. They're some of the best companies in the world. And they're not going to take a chance of ruining their reputation. And I could talk about BP, but that's not germane here. But BP doesn't deserve to be in the same room with those American companies. And any CEO of an American oil company will tell you why, but that's offline. We could talk about that. The other thing I would say is, as was alluded to here by my colleague Kathy, that 68% of Floridians and Congresswoman Shalala voted against offshore drilling last November. The people of Florida do not want this. And I don't care how conservative they are about everything else and about Trump and all this business, they don't want offshore drilling. In fact, I met with a bunch of really red folks last week asking me why I voted against Trump's emergency declaration and beating me up for that. And then they said, by the way, I hope you get that offshore drilling moratorium done. Okay? And this is what I said to the president and to Barnhart, and Rubio and Scott backed it up. Whoever protects Florida should get the credit for doing it. That's politics. I don't know much about politics, but we dropped the ball in the 115th Congress, and I'm hoping that this new team, that we can get it through here, and that Rubio can do what he's promised to try to do in the Senate to protect 21 million Floridians. Thank you very much.
Ms. Castro.
Well, thank you, Chairman Hastings, Ranking Member Cole, the committee, for the opportunity to be here today. It's a pleasure to be here with my partner, Congressman Rooney from Florida. He, as you can tell, is quite energetic, and he's very passionate about this because this is our way of life in the state of Florida. And even though it was 9 years ago, the devastating impact of the BP Deepwater Horizon blowout remains with me. Remember, it went on for 5 months. It happened in late April. 11 people killed because of the rig blowout. Oil spewed there from April through May, June, all of July, all of August. You all remember watching it constantly. I think CNN had the little ticker on there that showed it just spewing constantly, all the way through August till mid-September. It wreaked havoc, not just on Florida's economy, not just on our beautiful environment, but on people's lives. I remember very well holding a woman who had a small business in the Clearwater area as she wept because she lost everything that she had ever built. We were coming out of a recession, and the BP blowout was like a sucker punch. We didn't even have oil on the beaches in the Tampa Bay area that you could see, but it wiped out mom and pop businesses, motel owners, restaurant owners, everyone that relies on clean water for their livelihoods. Fishermen couldn't fish. It was a catastrophe. And even though it's 9 years later, we are still dealing with the mess. Whether it's deformed coastal fish and species, what the researchers at the University of South Florida say is still in the deep water on the floor in the Gulf of Mexico. They call it a layer of dirty snow. If you remember, they had to pour chemicals and dispersants in to try to break it up, and all of that is still out there, impacting the food web and everything that we love about the state of Florida. Congresswoman Shalala is right. U.S. travel estimates that we lost about $22 billion because of what happened. I think that's probably a lowball figure. This is dangerous, dirty business. Florida has chosen over time not to industrialize our coastline. Our economy is based upon those clean beaches and clean water, and we, as my partner, Congressman Rooney, said, Floridians have spoken. Last November, they voted by 69% to keep the oil rigs off of our coast. Oil drilling is not needed. We are an oil and gas exporter now. This drilling is not wanted. It's not welcome. Some areas of the United States of America are too special to drill, and the state of Florida is one. And that is why in 2006, a bipartisan Congress voted to impose a moratorium on drilling in the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The only problem is that it expires in 2022. So now it is our responsibility, with that deadline looming, to extend it. And we believe we should extend it permanently, because Floridians and folks all across this country that come to our beautiful state to vacation, they know it's not wanted, it's not welcome, it's not needed, and plus, our future is clean energy. That is what we should be investing in. That is what we should be spending time and debate on here. That is the future of the United States of America. That's where the jobs are going to come from. It's already showing up in the number of solar jobs and wind energy jobs and energy conservation. So I ask you, I plead with you, please bring this bill to the floor with a healthy rule. Let's pass this with a big bipartisan vote. You've got a bipartisan Florida delegation that is strongly in support of it, and we ask that you move this to the floor as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you very much for your testimony. No questions.
Ranking Member Cole. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Morelli. Dr. Burgess. Ms. Shalala. Ms. Lesko. And Mr. DeSaulnier. That's a record. Thank you. Thank you all so very
We
much.
want to welcome Ms. Castro back. She served this committee.
Well, thank you, and I will submit for the record the correspondence from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense and the Department of the Air Force that reiterates the importance of the military mission area in the eastern Gulf of Mexico.
Without objection. Does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Seeing none, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today and leave anything as you are now doing, and so that it may be inserted into the record with our stenographer. And you're now dismissed. We do have Ms. Lesko's amendment hanging out there, and you had testified about it earlier. You wish to go forward with it, or you just want to wait for? Yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. All right, then the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair, having seen no other members to testify on 1941, 1146, and 205. All right? So we're in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Okay. The Rules Committee will come to order. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 205, the Protecting and Securing Florida's Coastline Act of 2019, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-29, modified by the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. The rule further provides for consideration of H.R. 1146, the Arctic Cultural and Coastal Plain Protection Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-30, modified by the amendment printed in Part C of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part D of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part D of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Lastly, the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 1941, the Coastal and Marine Economies Protection Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 116-31, modified by the amendment printed in Part E of the Rules Committee report, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part F of the Rules Committee report accompanying the resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part F of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. You heard the motion from the gentlewoman from Florida. And let me, before I ask if there are any amendments to discussion, let me just make a request on the Democratic side and the Republican side. Is to the extent possible to urge our colleagues when they want to submit amendments to try to submit them on time, because I think it gives us an opportunity to be able to work with individual offices to try to make some necessary tweaks or to make sure that that CBO and the parliamentarian and all the other committees have the have the opportunity to be able to vet these amendments. But just to make it easier on both the majority and minority staff, I think if we could just I mean, obviously there were exceptions, we get it, but anyway, having said that, is there any amendment or discussion, Mr. Cole?
First, just some quick discussion and then an amendment, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to say, just associate my remark, or myself with your remarks about rules coming in on time or amendments coming in on time. I certainly understand the difficulty there, and to the extent our side was part of that, and we certainly were, we apologize for that. I think you're right. You need enough time to evaluate the amendments. And also, while I want to make it perfectly clear that Mr. Bishop does not represent the official Republican position on open rules, we are not.
You checked that box.
We're not going to ask for one tonight, and partly that's because of the 17 amendments that were made in order. 8 of them are Republican, and we appreciate that. I think that's a genuine effort on your part to work with us, and I'm particularly pleased my colleague Ms. Lesko's amendment was made in order. So we just want to thank you very much for that, and we'll forego an open rule
She deserves
request.
something for being on the committee, right?
A lot more than any of us get on either side of the aisle. If I may, though, we do have a request from one of our members for an amendment. So, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee add a section to the rule that provides that it shall be in order at any time through September 27, 2019, for the Speaker to entertain motions that the House suspend the rules relating to the bill H.R. 553 to amend Title 10, the United States Code, to repeal the requirement for reduction of survivor annuities under the Survivor Benefit Plan for military surviving spouses to offset that receipt of veterans' dependency and indemnity compensation and for other purposes. Mr. Chairman, on May 16th, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina filed a motion to have H.R. 553 added to the consensus calendar, but just as his bill was eligible for a suspension vote, the majority chose instead to self-execute the text of Mr. Wilson's bill into the NDAA. It's been 60 days since the House passed the NDAA. I'll remind my friends that the House NDAA did not garner a single Republican vote, unlike the process that took place in the Senate. The fate of the NDAA will now be determined by a conference committee. This amendment would simply allow the majority to correct the egregious error it made in changing the rules to prevent Mr. Wilson the vote to which he was entitled and worked hard to achieve. Mr. Chairman, let's put aside the political posturing, come together, celebrate the process you created with the consensus calendar, with a separate bipartisan vote that we can send to the Senate, where I'm sure it would have an excellent chance of passage.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion or comment? Mr. Woodall.
I am reminded that when we had this discussion as that rule passed, you said very earnestly that you supported including it in as a self-executing amendment because you wanted to see it become the law of the land. You believe this was the fastest way possible. Certainly after 60 days, it doesn't seem like this was the fastest way to get it done, and I would hope that we could make it, we could do as the ranking member has asked, but if not, I would ask what that timetable is. How long must these widows and widowers wait? What is that timeline, since it is a goal that every member...
Well, I thank the gentleman for his comment, and I would just remind him that when my friends were in charge, they didn't bring this up at all. I would also say that, the gentleman mentioned 60 days. I mean, we've been in recess for half of that time, and I still think that the NDA is probably, is probably the best bet to actually get this enacted. I support, obviously, the gentleman, Mr. Wilson's bill, and if it looks like it's not going anywhere, we'll revisit it. But I would urge a no vote on this.
If the gentleman would yield, I think you make my point, is you know the reason that we didn't bring it up is because we required that it be paid for. You didn't require that it be paid for. If there was no requirement that it be paid for, it would have come up in a Republican Congress. This isn't a Republican Democratic thing. This is an all of us thing. And I think we worried at the time it was self-executed that we were turning a bipartisan issue into a partisan exercise, and to suggest that we do disagree on this when in fact we don't, I think furthers that misconception.
Well,
I yield
I'm
back.
puzzled by the gentleman's excuse why the Republicans didn't bring it up. You brought up a tax bill that cost trillions of dollars and none of it was paid for. So I find that to be not a very credible excuse. But again, I would urge a no vote on this. The vote is now on the Cole amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. The chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
No.
Mr. Hastings, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin, no. Ms. Scanlon?
No.
Ms. Scanlon, no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli, no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala, no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mrs. Lesko? Mrs. Lesko, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman, no.
Clerk, report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
Amendment is not agreed to. Further amendments.
Chairman?
Mr. Woodall.
I did, among the Republican amendments that were made in order, the ranking member did not have any of his made in order. I would like to move that we amend the rule to make in order Mr. Bishop's amendment number 10 that allows the Secretary of the Interior, in cooperation with the Secretary of Defense, to decide which of those areas are in fact defense mission critical and which are not, and after the moratorium expires in 2022, make such decisions as may be necessary. Contrary to Mr. Lowenthal's comments about President Trump, as you will recall, this is a law that was put in place during the Bush administration, a law that remained in place throughout the entire Obama administration, and the amendment that Mr. Bishop offers is simply an opportunity to maintain current law.
You heard the gentleman's amendment. Any discussion? I would urge a no vote on this. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Further amendments? Hearing none, now the vote is on the motion from the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Clerk will go, a roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings, aye. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli, aye. Ms. Shalala? Aye. Ms. Shalala, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Aye. Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mrs. Lesko? No. Mrs. Lesko, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, will manage this for the majority. Right. So without objection, the committee is adjourned.